When you think about the word summer camp, you probably imagine things like canoeing, hiking, swimming, and telling ghost stories around a campfire. A girls' camp might include things like archery, arts and crafts, and drama. And campers usually arrive by bus to a secluded area where cabins are set up around a lake in thick woods. Parents send their kids off to experience nature and stay busy and out of their hair for the summer break. And some kids get a little homesick those first few nights being away from home for the first time, and others are excited to return year after year, where strong friendships can be made, and hopefully some good character will be chiseled into the lives of young boys and girls across all walks of life. And we've all seen the typical summer camp movie, where one side of the camp feuds with the other side, and the resulting pranks and chaos. And maybe these movies fill you with memories from your own childhood, or excitement about what your child might soon experience. But sometimes, our ideal vision of a thing can differ greatly from reality, and that was the case for the families of 3 young girls in the summer of 1977.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to give a quick warning that while today's episode won't be extremely violent, it may still be a difficult one for sensitive listeners because it does deal with violence towards children.
My sources for this episode were thecrimewire.com, coco.com, newspapers.com, which include articles from the Tulsa World and the Tulsa Tribune. And any other sources will be listed in our show notes. Well, Darlene, your daughter is getting ready to head off to summer camp soon.
Yes, she is.
Next, just in a few more days, really.
Right, yeah, Monday.
Yeah, and your niece and nephew are going.
Yes.
And my son was going to go, but it didn't work out.
Right.
But after this episode, you're
going to scare me to death.
I am.
I'm going to be terrified the whole time my daughter's gone, right?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. The timing, right?
Yes.
So it is that time of year.
Mm-hmm.
Summer break is upon us, and the kids are out of school. People are going on their vacations. And maybe our listeners have children going off to summer camp for a week or two. The summer camp experience, it provides so many opportunities for kids. I mean, I have some really good memories.
Me too.
From when I went to camp. And then my daughter herself, she went to Girl Scout camp for a couple of summers.
Okay.
I'll never forget, all those nighttime giggles and the crushes that we had on the boys at camp and just all the fun stuff we did. I broke my arm at camp one year.
Oh my goodness. Did you have to go home?
Well, the very first day I broke it. And my preacher at the time, he drove me back into town. Our camp was about an hour from our house.
Okay.
He drove me back into town, met us at the hospital with my mom, met my mom at the hospital, got my arm set. And then they thought I was going home. And then I was like, no, I'm not going home. I want to go back to camp. I'm not missing camp. And so I begged, and my mom let me go back. So my preacher drove me back to camp.
That had to have been the 80s or the 90s.
It was the 80s, mid-80s.
Yeah.
And so, and it was funny, too, because, you can't get a cast wet.
Right.
And they only had showers. And so I got some special treatment. I got to go to the director's cabin and take baths that week. And I was really milking that.
I'm sure.
Until, I realized, but I also can't swim. I can't get in the lake. I can't do any of the lake games. So that kind of knocked me off my high horse a little bit. But still, great, great memories.
Yes.
Let's talk about some summer camp experiences.
Okay.
In mid-June of 1977, a group of about 140 girls arrived at Camp Scott Girl Scout Camp in Locust Grove, Oklahoma. They had arrived at the secluded 400-acre camp earlier in the day by bus, and the excitement, the anxiousness, and the anticipation was, it was palpable. In the Kiowa unit, there were 8 cabins set up in a semicircle, and the counselor's tent was at one end of that arc. And then if you followed over like that rainbow shape to the other end of the arc was tent number 8.
Okay. So these were tents, not cabins.
Well, I'll explain what those were.
Okay.
They called them cabins, but they were really like platforms that
Okay.
had like canvas walls and roof.
Gotcha.
So it's like a tent over a platform.
Okay.
They're called cabins, but that's really what they were. And so they didn't have a real door. It was like
Okay.
a tent flap. So the canvas would roll up and stuff.
Oh, okay.
So that's what that looked like. And so tent number 8 was the furthest away from the counselor's tent. And all the other cabins or tents were located in that semicircle between the two.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
In each cabin, there were 4 cots set up. And so there were 4 girls per tent. And so I'm going to use the word tent and cabin interchangeably. I'll probably just try to stick to cabin.
Okay.
They arrived on Sunday evening.
Okay.
A thunderstorm rolled through. And so that kind of forced them inside. They didn't get to do their first night activities. And so they went in to write notes home and, just kind of get settled in their setting and get to know the other girls in their cabin for that first night. Now, it is not unusual for the first night of camp to be, a little bit lively.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the girls are away from home for the first time. So they're kind of acting up, having
Yeah.
fun, giggling. Some are kind of subdued, and some are like really homesick. So they may be crying,
Oh.
and some of the other girls may be consoling them. I've seen all of that.
Right.
And then some of them are trying to scare each other. They're screaming. So the counselors, usually that first night, those counselors are having to kind of, calm them down. This night, after lights out, the same thing was going on. Some of the girls were up between 12 and 1:30 a.m., and they were kind of giggling and talking loud. And one of the counselors had to go out and admonish them and send them back to bed.
Okay,
Get back in
yeah.
there. You know what I'm talking about. And a few girls reportedly heard one of the girls scream and yelling something that sounded like "Mama." Again, that's not actually out of the ordinary for a summer camp experience. It wasn't really anything that alarmed anyone.
Right. But it alarms me because of what this podcast is about.
So early the next morning, which would have been that Monday, their real true first day of camp, the Kiowa unit counselor, whose name was Carla Wilhite, she rose early. She headed to the showers before the campers got up. She walked along the trail and she came upon a startling discovery. There was a sleeping bag just off the trail in a wooded area. And she could see one of the girls kind of like on top of that unzipped sleeping bag. She quickly realized something was wrong. And upon further inspection, she saw 2 other sleeping bags in various places around the trail as well. And those 2 other ones were zipped up. Shockingly, she discovered in the first bag, which was the unzipped one of the campers had been savagely killed.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and things got chaotic real quick.
I'm sure. Were the girls able to see, like, the other campers?
No, because they were not awake yet.
Okay, good.
She was up around 6 a.m. and they didn't get up until about 7. Carla immediately ran for help. She notified the camp director and the nurse, and they both returned to camp with her. Of course, law enforcement was called, and they started arriving as soon as possible. And I'm not sure how they managed to not alert the girls. But
Maybe they just woke them up and ushered them somewhere else.
Well, what they did was they did reroute them from the trail when they did start getting up. And it could be that law enforcement maybe came in from a different way or just didn't come in that early. Maybe they weren't there yet. When the other 2 sleeping bags were opened, they discovered those other 2 young girls had also been brutally murdered and stuffed down into the bag. All 3 of the girls from tent 8 were dead. The girls were Denise Milner, age 10.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Michelle Guse, age 9. And then the youngest girl, Lori Lee Farmer, who was only 8 years old.
Oh, my goodness. So sad.
So very sad. There actually was supposed to have been a 4th camper in that tent, just as in all the others.
Uh-huh.
But there had been some kind of a delay with her, and so she was not scheduled to get there until this day.
I bet her parents were praising the Lord.
Yes. Can you imagine finding out afterwards
No.
that your daughter was supposed to have been in that tent? So back to the counselors not wanting to alarm the camper girls. They did reroute them away, like I said, from that area. And somehow they were able to keep it quiet what had happened.
Good.
And so they didn't tell the girls that they told them they were going home. And they
Okay.
didn't tell them why.
Okay. I was going to ask if they sent them home. I was hoping so.
Yes, they did. And I mean, again, this was right away. Their
Right.
very first morning, they wake up, they find out they're getting back on that bus to go home. but
They're
they don't know
probably all
why.
disappointed and
Right. And I'm sure they were a little bit suspicious, like, well, this is our first day and we're sent home. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sure they had to have been wondering what's up
Right.
and maybe a little creeped out.
Yeah.
But some of them may not even have thought that. They may have just been disappointed, like, what?
Sure.
So the camp authorities did contact the parents and tell them they needed to come get their children and made arrangements for the girls to return home. And so I'm feeling like maybe the police didn't arrive until after those girls had been taken out, because that
Okay.
happened pretty quickly.
Okay.
The young girl that Counselor Will Height had seen in the unzipped sleeping bag was Doris Milner, the 10-year-old,
Okay.
the oldest of those three. She had been beaten and strangled with a ligature. The other two girls, Lori and Michelle, the ones who had been stuffed into their sleeping bag and zipped in, they had both been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. And sadly, all three girls had been sexually assaulted.
Oh my goodness.
Now, later on, the examiner did say they had not been raped, but they had been assaulted or molested, is what they said. So there must have been some evidence of that.
Okay.
They did not go into detail. So we talked about the little girls who didn't have any idea why their adventure was being cut short. I am glad that the camp authorities did not tell them.
Oh yeah.
Their parents had to break it to them. So one little girl said, she asked her grandmother, why am I going back home? And the grandmother told her, honey, 3 girls were killed in your camp last night. And she had no idea.
I can't imagine the parents picking up their just finding out that there was a murder
Yes.
where their children had been.
So the parents who were contacted, who were the parents of those girls, were obviously told this was your child. But the ones that it didn't affect, some of them were even waiting, hoping it wasn't theirs. You know what I'm saying? They were just told some girls were murdered and you need to come and get your kids, and we're busing them back out. And they're all just hoping my
That
girl
it's
gets
not
off that
theirs.
bus.
Oh my God. Yeah, no.
That would be the worst thing
Yeah.
to have to wait through. Mays County Sheriff Pete Weaver was soon given control of the Grizzly case. Of course, news of the murders didn't stay quiet very long.
Yeah.
I mean, it started spreading like wildfire. Parents everywhere began to second guess their decision to let their kids go to camp.
I'm beginning to second guess mine.
I know. I feel bad. I feel bad that I'm making you feel that way. In the aftermath, even other camps in the state asked for parental involvement and volunteers to help ensure more secure camp experiences. They realized, maybe our camp's not that secure either.
Mm-hmm.
And even some of them asked for law enforcement presence.
Yeah, like guards.
Yeah, to ramp up their security, because they didn't know if this was going to be an isolated incident either.
Right.
And so it put everybody a little on edge,
Sure.
as you can imagine, yeah. Right away, authorities were searching everywhere in the dense foliage for any clues left behind by the perpetrator or perpetrators. They didn't know if it was one or more. Along the perimeter of the camp, they did come upon some beer bottles and a crowbar. They found some rope near the bodies, along with a pair of women's eyeglasses and an eyeglass case. And that's going to become important a little bit later on. We'll come
Okay.
back to that.
The glasses are just all those things.
Yeah, the eyeglasses.
Okay.
They also found a red flashlight, a partial roll of duct tape, and duct tape had been used to secure the girls. They had
Okay.
bound them,
So
bound
this
their
is
hands.
definitely evidence.
Yes. And the duct tape had also been used to cover the lens of that flashlight in order to dim the beam. So just a little bit of the light was coming out. And then curiously, a piece of newspaper dated April 17th, 1977. So just a couple of months before this happened.
Mm-hmm.
It had been used inside the flashlight, had kind of been crammed in there to keep the batteries from rattling around. And that newspaper becomes important later as well. When the investigators began to look inside tent number 8, they were greeted with a horrific scene. Pieces of the tent were broken, so that makes me think of a struggle, probably.
Yeah.
There was lots of blood, of course. It extended onto the tent flaps and the walls. There was so much blood on the floor of the platform that it was later airlifted to a crime lab. The whole floor was just airlifted to a crime lab for analysis. And it did look like whoever had done this had obviously killed the girls inside of the cabin or the tent and then had moved their bodies outside for whatever reason. It also appeared that they had tried to clean the blood up a little bit by wiping it with some of the covers and the mattress, had smeared it.
It's so crazy that if it was one person, could do this to 3, but I guess they're so young.
Right. And
8,
yeah,
9, and 10.
little
yeah.
girls. I mean, we're talking young girls.
Yeah.
And we're not sure what they had done to subdue them.
Right. True. Yeah.
Near the camp were 3 caves. Not everybody knew those caves were there. And if you went by it, you wouldn't necessarily see it. But if you were a local, you would know about it and you would know where to find it. And when detectives searched the caves, they found more clues, just as they had suspected they would and hoped that they would. Inside, they found more duct tape that matched the same type that had been used. Some of that newspaper from that piece that was shoved in the flashlight was found in the cave.
Okay.
So they knew that that person had been in both
definitely been there.
places. They found some grocery items and 2 photographs of unidentified women, which seemed a little out of place.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, that person had been on the Girl Scout property and had been hiding in those caves. And if they had not been sure before, they were after they found a note written on the cave wall that mockingly read, "The killer was here. Bye-bye, fools." Can you imagine?
That's terrible.
Sick. Also, so it's almost like the killer's just really laughing at them.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have any remorse for what he
No.
did either, or he or she or they, whoever they
Right.
were, if it was more than one.
And if they catch them and they're trying the crazy plea, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going for it, because I just was thinking about how you said that they had shoved the paper down in the light to keep the light from dimming. And so that means they knew they were doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That
It definitely shows that they plotted that
Yeah.
out. Like, this was not just something they did spur of the moment.
no, and they knew it was wrong because they were trying to hide it. They were trying to,
Exactly.
You know.
They were trying to cover their tracks.
yeah. So it wasn't like they were so out of their minds.
Also, within close vicinity of the camp was a ranch owned by a man named Jack Schroff. He informed the law enforcement that his ranch had recently been burglarized and that some of the items that had been taken included bottles of beer, food, tape, and rope.
Mm.
And although he reported it, of course, he became a person of interest because
Sure.
those things. I mean, he could have just been saying that.
Yeah.
However, because of his name being put out there, he and his wife started receiving threatening phone calls and
I
lots
bet.
of harassment. A newspaper report from June 20th of 77 stated that he had taken and passed a lie detector test.
Okay.
And so he had kind of been ruled out already.
Yeah.
The district attorney named Sid Wise, he did not consider him a suspect at this point at all. But because of all of the threats and stuff and the harassment that he and his wife were receiving, it caused them so much distress over that he ended up having to be hospitalized from chest pains
Oh.
from all the stress. I mean, he reported that those
Yeah.
things had been stolen. But yeah, I mean, and I can see why they had to make him a suspect.
Sure. But when
But-
people get stuff in their heads,
Exactly.
I mean, it's hard to, when these conspiracy theories start going out, it's really hard to, to turn people around in a different direction.
Right. By Thursday of that week, local papers were reporting that 3 excellent fingerprints had been taken from the bodies. They also flew in 3 tracker dogs from Pennsylvania to aid in hunting the perpetrator. They determined that the women's eyeglasses and case that they had found belonged to one of the counselors
Oh.
who had reported them stolen from her tent on that Monday along with her purse.
Oh, okay. Oh, so that means that somebody had been there.
Somebody
maybe
had been
stalking
there.
them, or maybe it was one of the counselors.
In fact, other weird things had gone on at the camp in the days leading up to this camp week. Just a few months before, in April, and remember that April 17 newspaper article was found.
Mm-hmm.
The camp had held a 3-day event during that, so it was like a training leading up to camp.
Right. For maybe the counselors
Yes.
or something. Okay.
And during that time, one of the tents that they were using had been broken into. And I say broken into, but again, there wasn't a door. It was just a flap. So then they entered the tent. They didn't actually break in, but they entered the tent and they ransacked it. And just like we had talked about that whole mocking thing,
Mm-hmm.
whoever had done that, for one, they ate up a box of donuts. And then inside the donut box, they left a note. They had several little small note pages, like from a steno pad.
Uh-huh.
They had written the word kill on several of the pages. And then on one of the pages, it said, "We're on a mission to kill 3 girls."
Are you serious?
Mhm.
No,
Now-
that's creepy.
Ominous.
And maybe they had saw that, but probably thought, Had they seen that? Yeah, they had obviously seen that before, but probably thought it was a joke or something.
Exactly. They reported that at the time, those girls in that tent, or the counselors that were in training, they reported that to the camp director, and nothing came of it. They blew it off as a prank. The counselor who found that note that said that and reported it, she did say later she heard that some of the campers had confessed to writing that note as a prank.
Oh.
And so it had kind of been dismissed as just that.
Okay.
But then later that actually became controversial. In this case, some of the parents were concerned because they felt like that threat had not been disclosed to them.
Yeah.
And that may have influenced their decision of whether to send their kids there.
Right.
And they felt like it was kept from them.
I can see that.
Some people suggested that maybe the campers just caved under questioning by camp authorities and admitted to something they didn't really do.
Oh.
Now, that was thrown around. I don't know where that came from and if there was any validity to it.
Okay.
That was just what some people were saying had happened. And there were a few other odd occurrences. On the night of the murders, Counselor Wilhite, the girl who found the bodies, she had heard a low, guttural, moaning type sound outside that night. She said when she would shine her flashlight in the direction of that, it would stop. And then when the light would go out, the noise would start. And she did hear that noise through the night. Now, I really think that might have been an animal.
You do? Okay.
When we get later into the case, we'll talk about that. But I don't feel like that was one of the girls because of the time frame and the fact that the noise would stop when the light shone on it.
Yeah.
I feel like an animal would do that.
You're right.
I don't feel like a girl needing help would do that. And nobody found what the source of that noise was. Another thing, now this is very creepy. The girls in tent 7, which was right next to tent 8, they said that during the night, someone had come up to their tent door, shone a flashlight into it. One of those girls said she saw a large man at the door, and then he just closed the flap and walked away.
Oh my goodness.
Now, I don't know if she just didn't, that would have scared me so bad as a child. I would have been but she might have been too afraid to go get a counselor.
Right. Or she might have thought it was a counselor.
She may have. I mean, she saw a large man and there shouldn't have been a man there.
Oh, because this was only women.
Right. This was a Girl Scout camp. But, you know what? At the time, she may have just thought it was a counselor. And then the next day whenever they left and she found out what had happened and they were questioned about it, maybe looking back, she thought, oh, that did seem like a man.
Okay.
Maybe she didn't put all those pieces together at that time.
Yeah, I didn't think about it just being women.
Yeah, and they weren't questioning her right after this happened. Remember, those girls went home and were told by their parents and everything first.
Oh, okay.
But still, that is very scary to think about.
I'm old school because I'm sitting here thinking, I don't think I would want to be out in the woods without a man. I know that probably sounds really sexist, but it's true.
Well, and two, this camp... So, they had a gate at the front, but now it's sitting on 400 acres.
Right.
They don't have a fence around the perimeter. So anybody could have come up from the back or come through the woods.
No.
Now, that would make me think, I don't know if I want to be out here. But I can tell you, when I was a kid, and I went to church camp, and so we had boys and girls, and they just had separate cabins.
Right.
And so we had
That's
men
how it
there.
was for us.
But never once did I ever think, I wasn't thinking about the fact that anybody could come into camp.
Right.
Never
as a
dawned on
kid,
me.
you're not.
No.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
But as an adult, as a counselor,
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
I'd probably been laying there scared every night.
Especially if I knew that in the days leading up to it, that place had been burglarized
Yes.
and had left a note.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have stayed and counseled if that had happened.
I know. I don't think I would have either. But if they had somebody admit to it.
Yeah. And again, there are a lot of pranks and stuff at camp.
There really
and
are.
people are telling stories to try to scare each other.
Sure.
You're hearing stories about murders.
Yeah.
That's probably where I got my first taste for true crime.
Right.
Was sitting at a camp listening to somebody tell stories like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that is a part of the camp experience.
It is. So you could tend to blow it off, and that's very believable.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing of note in this story is that sometime within the 4 or 5 days after the murders, when the search dogs had been brought in, a wild rumor began to float around. So this area is home to the Cherokee Indian people. A lot of Cherokee Indians live around there. And it was said that there were medicine men in the area. Mm-hmm. Weirdly enough, talk was going around that one of the local medicine men had put a curse on the search dogs and that they were all going to die.
Huh.
Yeah, and so you know how superstitious tales get
Yeah.
told. Well, surprisingly, 2 of those dogs did die.
Really?
One shortly after that. One from heat exhaustion, and then the other strangely jumped out of a moving car.
Oh my.
And it had never done anything like that before. So some people, like if you were superstitious
Yeah, I
and you
could
heard that,
see.
you would definitely be thinking that that was legit.
Yes.
Okay, I mentioned the district attorney earlier,
Mhm.
Sid Wise. He's another main player in this case, right along with Sheriff Pete Weaver.
Okay.
They're kind of like the 2 main people. And the OSBI was called in, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation.
All right.
OSBI. At some point, they all are kind of working this case. Sid was the district attorney, and some newspapers reported some conflict between the 2 camps, sheriff's office and the district attorney's office. The sheriff's department would seem to leak information, like those 3 good fingerprints and that kind of thing. And then the DA would either deny that and say, no, we didn't find that, or he would contradict it. And at one point, one said they had 1 good suspect. Another from the other camp said, we don't have any suspects. And then the OSBI said we have several suspects.
Okay. So
So-
they're not really working together.
They're not, and their stories aren't lining up very well together.
Okay.
And I think the sheriff would sometimes leak information like what they had found.
Which
and
may hurt the investigation.
And then the DA didn't want it out there, so he would say, no, that's not true.
Gotcha.
So we had a little bit of that. They had a little bit of that going on. After the papers began reporting that there was some infighting between those groups, Sid Wise, he instituted what he called a media blackout. He was keeping the media out of the case.
Okay.
It did later come out that he had made a deal himself with a local reporter.
Ugh.
So then people were thinking, well, he just didn't want the media to know because he's got this reporter that he's given information to. So there was a lot of controversy with that. He ends up after this case is over, had planned to run for attorney general. He did not end up running for attorney general, and he resigned his position.
Okay.
So I mean, there was definitely.
Was it corruption, do you think, or just?
I don't know that it was corruption. I think this was one lone man who made a bad choice, whether he really did make that deal or not.
Okay.
But I don't think like the whole department was in on it.
Okay.
And I think the sheriff was really fighting to find the truth of this case, and he probably didn't appreciate the district attorney making any deals with reporters.
Right.
Once all other suspects were ruled out, one man kept emerging as a probable suspect. Sheriff Weaver really did hone in on this. It was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian known by the name of Gene Leroy Hart. And Hart was not unknown to the local police. His mother and his grandmother both lived in close proximity to the camp, and he had grown up there.
So he would have had knowledge of where everything was. Okay.
He definitely would have. Those 2 photographs that we talked about that they found of 2 women in that cave, those photographs were able to be traced back to and linked to him. So that was a real key piece of evidence for him being in that area at that time, that he was in the cave.
Yeah, he knew those ladies and okay.
Yeah. Now the sheriff's department is definitely given very serious consideration as that this is the guy. They didn't know if he was working alone, but they really felt like he was involved. And just like we talked about, Hart's mother and grandmother lived in so close. He had grown up in these woods.
Right, had probably played back there as a
Yes,
kid.
he knew this area very well. And he was reputed to be a very good woodsman. I mean, again, he's a Cherokee Indian too. So not only did he know this area, but he knew the ways of surviving in the woods.
Right.
But he was also a convicted rapist
Oh.
who actually had escaped 4 years earlier and had remained in the area and yet still had managed to evade being recaptured.
Wow.
Up until this point, he is an escaped convict.
And a rapist.
With that evidence mounting, on June 23rd, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of those 3 little girls at the camp. But one problem was they still hadn't found him in order to arrest him. So the charges were drawn up, but they did not have him in custody. All of their efforts now were on finding him. On June 24th, a manhunt, which used over 600 armed lawmen and volunteers, swept that whole area around the camp.
Well, did that have anything to do with, was like the tribe hiding him and like tribal law?
Some people did think that he was being helped by friends and family and other members of his tribe. I do have some details about that
All right.
that play in the case later a little bit. But that's a good question.
Okay. But just because he's a Cherokee, that doesn't have any bearings on if he can or cannot be charged in these murders, right?
No, it doesn't.
Because I didn't know.
Right, if they
tribal
have
laws
their own
sometimes
law.
have their own jurisdiction.
But at this point, no, this didn't have any bearing on that. And
Okay.
again, he was actually only out because he had escaped. After hours of searching unsuccessfully, the search was just called off. They didn't find anything. But at one point during that search, one of the search dogs turned up beaten badly. And that kind of ended the search. So again, I mean, nobody knew who did that. Weirdly enough, there were times that it seemed that the killer was actually stalking the camp. At one point, at the end of July, they had a security team posted at the camp. They saw a silhouette of a man, and so they were like trying to go out and search and see if they
Was
couldn't.
this camp still going on like normal?
No,
Okay, good.
no, those girls were sent home, and that camp was stopped immediately.
Okay, so there was no.
They
no
just had
more
a security
okay.
team, and now basically it's a crime scene, and they're searching, trying to find him in those woods.
But maybe the sicko just, some of them, they just like to go back to the scene and like relive their.
And that's what it sounds like. And it does sound like he is definitely mocking those cops.
Yeah. Especially beating the police dog if he's the one.
Well, no, they don't have any explanation. Who else would have beaten the
Yeah.
police dog? I mean, I'm
Ugh.
thinking it had to be in the murderer.
Mm-hmm.
So they went in search of that silhouette of the man that they thought they saw. They didn't find that. The dogs didn't find anything. But when they got back to camp, mysteriously, a plastic bag with a pair of shoes in it was left on the steps waiting for them. And those shoes had the name of that one little girl, Denise Milner, written on them. They were her shoes.
Oh, my gracious.
Nobody was ever able to determine who left the shoes. They said, well, they weren't there an hour ago.
That's so creepy.
So they speculated, well, maybe the OSBI came and dropped off some of this evidence. And they said, no, that was not us. Nobody could explain that.
The murderer.
It had to have been. Again, that whole mocking thing. Now, some people said, no, that stuff had already been in evidence and somebody just pulled it out. But nobody could say who did it. And nobody came forward and said, oh, yeah, I left those shoes. So let's get back to what you were talking about. Some of those people, his friends and family in the Cherokee Nation, they didn't believe Hart was guilty. And therefore, they were tight-lipped when they were questioned.
Is there a reason they didn't think he was guilty? He was a rapist. A convicted rapist.
A convicted rapist. You would think that they would, but no. It's crazy a little bit that the people who still supported him. Got a little information about that too.
Okay.
It was speculated that Hart was being helped by his supporters. Somebody speculated that he had a medicine man helping him. There's a lot of superstition in that whole the Native American thing. There were a lot of rumors that he could shapeshift. Some people thought he could shapeshift and turn himself into different things and get away when he was being searched for. Just all kinds of rumors like that flying around.
People probably thought that for real. A
lot of people
all these
believed
crazy
it.
things were happening around the camp.
It actually is said that, the officers don't give a lot of credence to that. But after not being able to find him for weeks and then months, it is said that they actually consulted their own medicine man.
Really?
To try to get help. And one did help them. Maybe they were trying to use that as a tool.
Right.
To kind of help get them on their side.
Yeah.
Well, Hart's mother, her name was Ella Mae Buckskin. She claimed that her son was not guilty. And she said he was actually being framed by Sheriff Weaver because Sheriff Weaver didn't have any other suspects and he was under pressure to solve this case because it did involve children. That reminds me of another mother who protected her baby boy.
Mm-hmm.
Some mothers really do refuse to believe that their children are guilty of any wrongdoing. I don't know, like you said before, I never could figure out why do they believe that he didn't do it when he's obviously
capable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because probably they're like, well, yeah, he did this, but he would never do this. Do you know what I mean?
Maybe like, oh, yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him in a minute, about his past history.
But I've seen that before, like people in prison, they're like, they'll gang up on and like beat up these other people because maybe they murdered somebody, but these other people are worse because...
That's because we all want to compare ourselves to some. We judge ourselves based on how rotten other people are. So we're not that bad.
Right.
When really our standard is Christ. If we measure ourselves by Him, we realize that we're all sinners, and we're not as good as we think we are. But
The Lord really leveled that playing ground. Didn't
yes, he did. But we do like to compare ourselves to others because then we feel like we measure up and we don't come out so bad.
Yeah.
Don't
But
we?
the mom probably, she didn't want to believe he could stoop that low. Like, yeah, maybe he raped women, but he would never do that to
To children.
Yeah.
So we just did a case where the mom protected her baby boy so much that she actually helped him commit heinous crimes.
Right.
She was obviously just as bad as him. In this case, this mom, she says that she believed in God. You know, I'll talk about that too. But she really believed he was innocent. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, I just don't want him to get caught, so I'm going to help him. She fully
truly
believed in
believed.
him.
So that is a little bit different than Northcott's mother, who knew
Exactly.
what he was doing
And helped.
actually witnessed it and still
Helped cover it up.
helped cover it. Yeah.
Just 2 weeks after the murders, Miss Buckskin complained about harassment from the authorities. They had indeed searched her home and set up surveillance, rightfully so, but she claimed they had questioned one of her other sons 9 times within 2 days. The authorities admitted to questioning him, but they said it had not been that many times. They said, yeah, that would have been excessive. We didn't do that. The mother stated she did not know where her boy was, but her quote in the July 1st Henrietta Daily Freelance says, "My boy didn't do it. God gave me a vision. He told me what was a-happening, and he showed me that my boy ain't even in this state."
Wow. Oh.
Yeah. In the days that followed, interviews with neighbors and others in the community where Hart was from, they expressed they just didn't believe Hart had committed the murders. He had a lot of support from his community. He was well known. He was well liked, you know?
Why? Okay. I'm so confused. Did they believe that he committed those rapes before?
I think they felt like he was being railroaded
Okay.
because of his Native American heritage.
Okay.
And, you know, I think, you know, they don't trust the white men and
Yeah.
the white law officers anyway.
Right.
And so you kind of join together. If he says, I didn't do it, maybe they did think, well, he didn't do those other ones either.
they thought
Like,
he didn't. Yeah. Didn't do any of it. Okay. That makes more sense to me, honestly.
Then covering up and
Yeah.
I feel like if they felt like he was railroaded in those previous crimes, he probably,
So he didn't, I guess, fit the profile maybe of what they would have thought
in their minds.
in their minds. Yeah.
But in his criminal past, which I'm going to tell you about, he fits the profile exactly
Okay.
of what we're looking of what and whom they were looking for. Okay, I'm going to go back and talk about his past now. I'm going to give you a little more detail.
Yeah. I'm curious.
As a high school student, like I said, he had a reputation as a talented football player, especially his senior year. He got a lot of glory that year. Sadly, after high school, after his glory days were over, he did have a short marriage and he did have a son. His marriage ended pretty quickly, and I don't even think he really saw his son after that either. Like, he didn't have a relationship with the mother of his child or his child.
Okay. Did she leave or he just didn't? Was that him? Was that on him or her?
Reports didn't say.
Okay.
I did look. I couldn't find anything. I don't even think his ex-wife during this case added much to any of that.
Gotcha.
Hart took up some unsavory activities. At the age of 23, he abducted 2 young pregnant women from a nightclub outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He drove them to Mays County, where he brutally raped and sodomized them.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. And miraculously, they survived that attack and were able to report that.
Oh my gosh.
So he was caught and charged with rape and kidnapping. But get this, he was released on parole just a very short time later. He didn't serve very much time for that at all and was released on parole.
Why do they let these sexual offenders go?
That is sexually violent crime. Why would you let him out on parole? That right there makes me angry because these 3 little girls would have still been alive had that not happened.
Yeah.
I'm thinking any sexually violent crime, you should not be out on parole.
No.
So, of course, he was not rehabilitated. He continued a life of crime, but this time he started burglarizing homes. He hit 4 homes before he was caught, and he actually burglarized the home of a female law enforcement officer, and that's how he got caught.
Okay.
She was able to stop the crime in action. Because he was on parole for those other 2 crimes, they gave him, at that point, now his sentence has been upped.
Okay.
He was given consecutive sentences of 90 years each. equaling around 350 years.
Well, good.
Yeah, and that should be the end of that, right?
It should be.
However, it wasn't, because in 1973, while he was being transported to a hearing, that's when he managed to escape. He was caught quickly and returned, and however, it wasn't long until he was able to escape a second time.
So was he in a maximum security prison, or you don't know?
Yeah, it didn't say.
Okay.
If it was, I mean, he's really good at
Yeah.
escaping. I'm like, I mean, maybe he was shapeshifting his way out of there. I don't know.
Seriously.
Anyway, 4 years later, in 1977, which is when this crime takes place, he had still managed to evade police, as I had said, and so he was on the run. And it was then that those Girl Scout murders took place. And so, of course, his name comes up as a suspect.
Yes.
He's out. His mother lives there. They know he's in the area.
He's a violent sexual offender.
And he's a violent sexual offender. There you go. So he is on the radar of the officers pretty early on. Unfortunately, the searches for him continued for the longest time with nothing turning up until 10 months after the crimes. April the 6th, 1978, an informant gave some information to the authorities that helped them figure out where to look for him. They did some surveillance for several days. They did find Hart holed up at a home in Cookson Hills, which was only about 45 minutes from Camp Scott. The OSBI agents arrested Hart after he made a brief attempt to run out the back door, but they were able to secure him.
Good.
And interestingly enough, he was wearing a pair of women's glasses at the time of the arrest.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. An inmate who had been with him when he was incarcerated before
Uh-huh.
said he just had a thing for wearing women's glasses. And if there were women's glasses laying around, he was going to take them and steal them.
That is a weird fetish.
Definitely. And do we
Wow.
remember that one of those counselors had reported her glasses had been stolen,
Yes.
and those were found
Yep. At the crime scene, right?
at the crime scene, right in the very vicinity. And so when they pick him up, he is wearing another pair of women's glasses.
That's weird.
Very odd. But to me, again, it proves that it was him.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence mounting.
But that's pretty strong circumstance.
Yeah,
for
it is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of good cases are made with circumstantial evidence.
I do too.
Personally.
I mean, I know you have to be careful when you're on a jury. I feel like some of it is so strong.
Yeah. You can be convicted based
Yes.
on strong circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, and rightly so, I think.
Sure. Me too.
Once he was apprehended and charged with the murders, there was a push to have his trial moved to a different venue. Remember, he was from Mays County, so he had a lot of supporters there. You know, most of the time they'll say, oh, we need to move this case because he can't get a fair trial.
Right.
People know about it. But in his case, they wanted his case to stay there because he had a lot of support there. So it was almost like the opposite of what normally. The authorities definitely wanted that case moved.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And it was in his interest to keep the trial right where it was. And so they did. The trial began on March 19th, 1979, with a jury of 6 men and 6 women. The main evidence that the prosecution had was a smudged fingerprint, and it was unusual because it was smudged.
Oh, okay.
A muddy footprint on the trail that did not match Hart's shoe size.
Oh.
Hair and semen samples.
They had hair and semen samples?
They had hair and semen samples. They got a semen sample off of a pillowcase that was in Denise Milner's sleeping bag.
Okay, but I'm guessing in the 70s that would have almost been useless.
Right, because at that time DNA really had not been something they could use in court. That was kind of new technology that wasn't even really available yet.
Okay.
They had the DNA, but they didn't really have anything they could do with it
Yeah.
then.
But did they save it?
They did save it.
Oh, good.
As much as could be saved.
Okay.
They had an expert witness at the test that had testimony. They testified that the sperm found on the girls could possibly be a match to sperm that they found in Hart's underwear, but not definitively.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They weren't doing DNA. They were just trying to match it up based on, I guess, the cells and stuff in the sperm. There was also an ex-employee of Sheriff Weaver who testified that he had seen the photographs attributed to Hart. Remember those photographs found in the cave?
Yes.
He said he had seen those in the sheriff's desk, and he was indicating that those photos had been planted on Hart. And this was an ex-employee. Sheriff Weaver said this man was committing perjury, and he seriously considered charging him for that after the trial.
I bet I would too
Yeah.
if he was lying.
Yeah. The mom and some of the people in the Cherokee Nation tribe, they actually called in the American Indian movement. It was like this group
Right.
to kind of oversee some of these searches that had been going on at the time. Because again, they felt like he was getting railroaded.
Okay.
And so they did call in some upper tribe organizations to kind of help oversee and keep the cops from
And how did that
unfairly-
go? Like, how did they feel? Or you don't know?
They were there to protect him
Gotcha.
and his rights.
So they had a bias for him.
They did.
probably.
The hair and semen samples that they had could not be definitively matched to Hart. So that circumstantial evidence from the caves. And see, you think about it, they had those beer bottles. If they had had DNA
I know, it
technology,
would've
they
been
could.
so easy.
All of that would have been easy, but they just didn't have it. They did have the semen and the hair, but not enough what they needed to do.
Okay.
They couldn't prove anything. The state was not able to make its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Oh, I hate that.
I do too. So on March 31st, 1979, Jean Leroy Hart was acquitted in the charges in the murder of those 3 little girls.
No.
Many in the courtroom were visibly shocked. The investigators in the case had fully expected a guilty verdict. Many times, when a jury deliberates, if it doesn't take them long, they're coming back with a guilty verdict.
Right.
They had deliberation that afternoon. They asked to rehear some of the testimony, and then they said, we're going to sleep on it, and we'll have a decision in the morning. So it wasn't that long, just a few hours. The next morning, they talked for only like 40 minutes, and then they had a verdict ready.
Oh, goodness.
So
Okay.
everybody was expecting guilty because of the quickness factor.
Yeah.
When it came back not guilty,
They were stunned.
they were stunned. Lori Farmer's mother, who was the little girl, the youngest little girl, her mother was in the courtroom. She left the courtroom in tears. And Hart's family and friends, they left the courtroom with surprised smiles of relief. Sheriff Weaver left in disappointment, still convinced that Hart was indeed guilty of those murders. Keep in mind that although Hart was acquitted of the crimes, he still had to return to prison
Good.
because he's got to still finish that sentence that he had,
yes.
which was over 300 years that
Okay.
so he's not going to get out.
Right.
Interestingly enough, he did not end up serving even 1 whole year of that sentence.
What?
For in June of 1979, just a little over 2 months after he was taken back, he dropped dead suddenly of a heart attack while jogging at the correctional facility.
Oh, my goodness. That's
I
not
know.
where I expected this to
I
go.
know. So, yeah, he was transported to the hospital. Doctors tried to revive him. They were not able to. His death came as a shock to family and friends. They said that he was now 35. He was 33 when the murders were committed, 35 when this happened. They said he kept himself in good health. He seemed well the last time they had seen and talked to him.
Were they probably blaming the police for killing him?
Probably. I will
Yeah.
tell you this. Sheriff Weaver himself made a comment that indicated maybe he believed that the death was not a natural one.
Really?
His quote is, even convicts have their code of honor.
Ah.
He might have felt like other inmates were retaliating for the death of children,
Okay.
death and sexual assault of children.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he did say that. I personally believe that his maker, he had to meet his maker. He didn't get justice here,
But he got it.
but he got it. And
Yeah. Swift.
sometimes it's very much later, and sometimes we're not going to see it even on our side until
Right.
later. But he got it swiftly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sad to read that.
Mm-mm.
However, when his mother heard the news of her son's death, she became hysterical and had to be sedated.
That's sad to me.
Well, it's sad for her because she
Yeah.
really believed he was innocent.
Yeah.
I don't know how she could believe that, but she
She
did.
did.
And as a mom, it
You can
broke her heart.
sympathize. Yeah.
Also, very sad is that Camp Scott never reopened after that tragedy.
I can.
Yeah, it was
I
too
can see that.
it was too hard to overcome the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
So that just didn't happen. The families of the slain girls, they brought a civil suit against the Magic Empire Council of Girl Scouts in 1979. They sued for over $3 million. They contended that several warning signs were ignored by the camp. The prowlers in the days that led up to the camp, the threatening note that they said was a prank. They said there was not adequate security given to the camp that could have protected their children. But the families did not win that suit.
Oh.
The jury ruled in favor of the Girl Scout Council.
I mean, I kind of agree with the families, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can see both sides, but I don't know. I just sympathize with the family.
I can understand that, this is a camp on 400 acres. They can't really have a fence all the way around it. And, they do have a gate up front, and they couldn't maybe have kept somebody out the back way.
Sure.
That is a lot of property, and you don't know who can slip through the woods. But
They could have notified.
the prowler and that note that they just blew off as a prank,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, you know what? If that was my child laying there dead,
Yeah.
and I knew about that, I would want them to be held accountable for
Me too.
not doing something about it and not informing the campers'
Yeah.
parents.
At the very least,
At the very least,
they could have informed. And they could have said, "Look, we believe that this is a prank, but
you should be
here's
aware
what
of it."
happened." Yeah.
And then you could have made an informed decision.
Exactly.
I don't like it when people are not given the chance to make an informed decision.
Yep.
In the aftermath of the case, the mother of Lori Farmer, her name is Sherry, she set up the Oklahoma Parents of Murdered Children Foundation, becoming an advocate for families of victims. Michelle Goose's father, Richard, he worked to get the Oklahoma Victims Compensation Board started, and that was to assist with the financial burden on families with victims of violent crimes.
Okay.
I thought that was really good because,
Yeah.
if you lose a loved one to a violent crime, you have a lot of cost with that.
Yeah.
And if you're from a, they were not a poor family, but if you were, that sometimes is a burden to the families on top of the burden they're already facing.
Right.
So I thought that was a good thing. Betty Milner, she recently moved from her family home where Denise had been raised until she died at age 10. And she only visited the gravesite once because she just couldn't bring herself to face it.
Oh.
But when she did finally go visit it, she said she was glad she did. She still mourns the loss of her daughter. And she has been convinced of Hart's guilt ever since that trial. She says she sat through every single day of that trial and she was convinced he was
That
the
he
guilty
was
party.
guilty.
What is still unclear, though, is whether he had an accomplice.
Yeah.
Especially since that shoe print outside didn't match his size.
Right.
I mean, I feel like he obviously did it.
Yeah.
I just don't know if there was somebody else who was in on it
With
that he
them.
didn't have help.
And there were 3 girls. I mean, unless he threatened, who knows? I guess it
Well,
could
he
have.
had used a crowbar on 2 of them. So if he
Okay.
hit them quickly, I mean, I even hate to talk about it.
I know.
But if he hit them quickly, I would think maybe it would have knocked them out.
Yeah, that's true.
But who knows? We really don't know
Mhm.
what happened at that crime scene. But I'm not convinced that there may not have been somebody else.
Yeah, me either.
It seemed that this case had reached a finality with the death of Hart. However, there is a new sheriff in Mays County these days.
Oh, and they still have the DNA.
They still have the DNA. Sheriff Reed, who was only a boy when those murders took place, so he remembered it from when he was a kid. When he became sheriff, he was asked to give the case another look with a fresh set of eyes, and because people still want answers.
Yeah, of course.
And he felt he could at least do that. He also asked the OSBI to reassess. When those 2 agencies together consulted with the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 23 more homicide investigators, FBI behavioral analysis, and profilers all re-examined it. And they all came to the same conclusion that Gene Leroy Hart committed these murders. They did suggest that the families have that DNA tested again.
Yes.
The DNA actually had been tested in the 80s in the late 80s.
Okay.
When it started becoming available, and it was inconclusive at that time.
Okay.
Again, that technology just had not caught up to where it is
Right.
now. It was tested again in the early 2000s. Still, they just weren't
Ugh.
able to get anything from it.
Okay.
But with advances in technology, they thought it's worth a try to test one more time now.
Right.
But there's a hefty price tag with that. I mean, it was
Yes.
going to be like $30,000,
Okay.
and the families would have to cover that.
So sad.
I know, but not to worry. The community of Mays County came to the rescue.
Oh,
They worked together and they raised every dime of that money
good.
to have that tested. I know that speaks
love
volumes
that.
for that. I know it does kind of give a nice little relief at the end of this
Yeah.
hard story to tell. In 2022, the results of further DNA testing strongly suggested Hart's involvement in the crime. So they couldn't say definitively, but they got enough to say it strongly suggests.
Okay.
And ruled out every other suspect they had. So it did seem that the families would have some closure after
Yeah.
all. Even if the court decision did not agree with it, Hart faced his justice anyway, even earlier than he would have had he been convicted.
Yep.
And so I think that's a very fitting ending to this story.
I agree. Oh, Those were hard times.
They sure were.
Now those were some hard times. And according to Mr. Ballin, every year hundreds of people get abducted by aliens right here in our national parks and forests. If you want a guarantee to protect yourself against UCOs, unidentified camping objects, you make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check out Hard Times and True Crimes. Until next time, goodbye.